In this presentation, I'm going to talk about hypothesis testing. Hypothesis testing is at the heart of the scientific method. You have to understand what we mean by a causal hypothesis. So, hypothesis testing involves posing a causal hypothesis. And a causal hypothesis is the statement of relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. What it does is it describes a cause and an effect, a relationship between the independent variable on the dependent variable. And causal hypotheses are usually stated in two forms, the null and the alternative. What's important to understand are two things. One, the alternative hypothesis is almost always the causal hypothesis, the hypothesis that you or I state, that you or I explicitly trust, explicitly attest. That is the causal hypothesis, and that is almost always the alternative hypothesis. Whatever there is outside of the alternative hypotheses, whatever remains, whatever options exist in the explanation of that relationship, is called the null hypothesis. Together, these two forms of hypotheses are both mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And what that simply means is that between the null and the alternative are all the options of possibilities in the relationship between the two variables. And if one of them happens, in other words, if the alternative is true and supported, then the null cannot be true and cannot be supported. And if the null were supported, the alternative cannot. There are also two types of causal hypotheses which we distinguish between. The first causal hypothesis is what is called as a one-tailed hypothesis. A one-tailed hypothesis is when you, the researcher, hypothesizes or proposes a relationship between an independent and dependent variable that is directional. So here's an example of a causal hypothesis. Employee training will reduce employee absenteeism. Notice, first things first, the causal hypothesis is your alternative hypothesis. So in other words, your alternative hypothesis would be that employee training would reduce employee absenteeism. But the key word here is reduce. And what that tells you is that there is a direction to this hypothesis. And when a hypothesis proposes either an increase or a decrease, it is proposing a direction in the tail of the distribution, either left-tailed or right-tailed. And therefore, this is a one-tailed hypothesis. And, as I just said, the null hypothesis is everything other than what's existing if the relationship between the alternative hypotheses is not supported. So if the relationship in the alternative hypothesis in this case is not supported, which is a reduction, what is left is either no change in absenteeism or an increase in absenteeism. And therefore, your alternative will be there will be less absenteeism as a result of training. And as you can see, our hypothesis here is on the left side of the tail, which is a reduction. And therefore, this is called a one-tailed hypothesis. Causal hypotheses can also be two. And if you understood what a one-tailed hypothesis is, then it's pretty simple to understand what a two-tailed hypothesis is. A two-tailed hypothesis is a statement of relationship that does not specify direction. So here's an example of a new drug treatment causing a difference. And when you use the word difference here instead of an increase or a decrease, you're not specifying which side of the distribution your relationship will be towards. And therefore, what is left here is that there will be no change, which is the opposite of what would happen if your alternative hypothesis was not supported. Now, your alternative hypothesis is exactly your causal hypothesis. And since you don't specify a direction, this is called a two-tailed hypothesis. So we have one-tailed hypothesis and two-tailed hypotheses. Your hypothesis is the alternative hypothesis. Your stated hypothesis is always the alternative hypothesis. What's left after the alternative hypothesis, or if the alternative hypothesis is not supported, is your null hypothesis. And together, the null and the alternative hypotheses are collectively exhaustive and mutually exclusive.